Hello Internet, Taliesin here, and today we are talking bosses, we are talking factions, and we are talking World of Warcraft Battle for Azeroth. Because of all of the ingredients that go into making the filling and tasty stew that is our favourite MMO, these are the two most important. WoW is, after all, nothing without its iconic raid encounters. Illidan, the Lich King, Deathwing, okay, we don't talk about Deathwing, Kill Jaden, huge figures that whole expansions are built around, epic storylines lead up to, and who can only be defeated through dedication, coordination, and the magical power of friendship to achieve the actual most important thing about the game, the fattest of all loots. And then there's the factions, the two distinct playable halves of Warcraft that create its one glorious whole. The Horde and the Alliance are so important to the overall identity of this game. Are you spiky or smooth, edgelord or sexual deviant? Do you like elves or do you prefer elves? These are the kind of deeply personal decisions that go into choosing your faction and defining your WoW experience. And yes, some may argue that the Horde and Alliance have now been forced to band together against so many world-ending threats that the glory days of the faction rivalries are long gone, and in that respect it's less World of Warcraft, more World of slightly tense and resentful family Thanksgiving craft. And in fairness, those people may well have a point. Legion saw us mingling quite happily with the so-called opposing faction in our order halls like it was Christmas Day 1914, but it's fair to say that the new expansion is taking a very different approach. Because in Battle for Azeroth, the faction war is back in a big way. Cities are burning, territories are changing hands, and new allies are being recruited on both sides as both factions scramble to control the Azerite arms race. And it's true, most of us feel pretty confident we know how this is going to pan out. We'll fight amongst ourselves for the first part of the expansion before it turns out there's a much more important, oh god, world-ending threat on the horizon. And actually, now I think about it, what was that you were saying about the magical power of friendship just a minute ago? And in all likelihood, that probably is how things are going to pan out. But there's this nagging feeling that I just can't shake when it comes to Battle for Azeroth. Blizzard are pushing the faction war so hard this time around that I just wonder, will they follow this to its natural conclusion? Instead of having us band together to take on a common foe as usual, instead of there being one final big bad of the expansion, maybe there are two. Two different final bosses, one for each faction. So join us as we look at why and how this could happen and ask, could the Horde and Alliance have different final fights in Battle for Azeroth? Okay? Go, 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 go. Let's look at the why, would, how, and who of this question. So first of all, why would Blizzard feel the need to have a different final boss encounter to finish the expansion? After all, it would be possibly the biggest change ever to the pillar that WoW is built around, raiding. Quite simply, it has never happened before. Whatever the themes and stories of any expansion, Horde and Alliance always end up fighting the same raid bosses, and for very good reasons. But the answer to why Blizzard might feel like they want to have a different final boss for each faction this time around is actually the easiest to answer of the lot, because A, if they really do want to make this expansion about the faction war above all else, it makes sense that we wouldn't have a common enemy to team up against at the end, and B, it would be really cool. Partly because it would be so unexpected. Like I say, the majority of the player base is second-guessing Blizzard at this point, because they say Battle for Azeroth is all about the fight between the Horde and Alliance, and we say, yeah right Blizz, whatever, look forward to when we join forces to take out N'Zoth at the end, lol. Truth be told, I think that myself. But what if Blizzard are telling the truth? They are already doing a great job of pitting the Alliance and Horde player bases against each other. Teldrassil burning, Lordaeron falling, Sylvanas' ethically questionable behaviour, and Saurfang's apparent deflection are all designed to stir reaction and debate among long-time players. And that's before you even get to the salt surrounding who gets the coolest new druid forms. Having the Horde finish the expansion by taking on a significant Alliance figure, and the Alliance taking out an important Horde character, would be the natural conclusion to all of this. And a way for Blizzard to show that they really are serious. This time, the war really means something. If you stepped into the final raid to kill Sylvanas and end the war, for example, you really are doing it for the Alliance, in a way that hasn't been true for any raid in WoW history. And if the why of this idea is obvious, the next question is, of course, would Blizzard do this? After all, it would be breaking with over 13 years of raiding infrastructure to have two different final raid bosses and presumably therefore two different final raid experiences for Battle for Azeroth. But then next expansion is already one for firsts. For a start, Blizzard are giving us two entirely separate leveling continents in Zandalar and Kul Tiras. And that's not different quest lines in the same zones like other expansions. That's not separate zones on the same continent like the beginning of Warlords. That's 10 levels worth of questing and story content, which is on an entirely different landmass class to the other. An entire expansion's worth of leveling content which is 100% inaccessible to the opposing faction, and ends with you recruiting a whole new playable race which is also exclusive to your faction. So what I'm saying is, they are not afraid of faction-specific content this time out. And then there's the two major new gameplay features of the expansion, Island Expeditions and Warfronts, both of which are thematically based purely around defeating the opposing faction and claiming resources or territory. These aren't scenarios which further the story like in Mists, it's straight up Horde versus Alliance hostility for the sake of it, because that is the story of the expansion, remember? And then there's this thought, Blizzard are certainly giving the impression that they want to focus on a more complex and subtle story in Battle for Azeroth. With Christy Golden being taken on full-time and her influence already showing in the superior Legion epilogue cinematics, it's likely that the narrative of the next expansion will be a bit less black and white than previous efforts. Already there's genuine debate to be had about the rights and wrongs of what happens to Teldrassil and Lordaeron, for example. And in a story where it's possible to understand the motivations of both sides, there's less need to have a common enemy. The faction war has always taken a back seat when it comes to the big bad of an expansion by necessity. The only way to justify one faction losing is to give it a Garrosh-style evil. If the story is better, and both sides have understandable and justifiable reasons to attack, say, Anduin and Sylvanas, then I can honestly see a scenario where Blizzard decide that would be a fitting and satisfying end to the expansion. So would Blizzard do it? I think yes, they would. But how would they do it? Okay, this is a more difficult one, because it's not just narrative reasons that have seen Horde and Alliance always taking on the same raid bosses before now, but also of practicality and balance. From a logistics point of view, raids are a massive resource drain to design and build. A staggering amount of craft, art, and thought goes into each one. If we have two different final bosses, that means two different final raids, really, doesn't it? Which is double the work for half the reward, because potentially only 50% of the player base will see each version. And then there's the even more important question of balance. The most obvious reason why we've never had different raid bosses for Horde and Alliance is because that's not fair. Whatever you think of it, the world first race is a genuine thing and people take it very seriously, as in they do it as a job seriously. Can you really imagine if you had different raid bosses for Horde and Alliance and one of them was easier than the other? It would make the whole flying debate feel like a sensual massage from Idris Elba, where you end up feeling not just relaxed but also safe. So very, very safe. It would be the biggest controversy in the history of WoW, and in all likelihood it would kill the game. So basically I can see why Blizzard might want to steer well clear of it. But then I think of the new Battle for Azeroth dungeon, the Siege of Lordaeron, which is an attack on the Alliance capital by outside forces. Now here, Alliance and Horde can both play the dungeon, but they appear to have different storylines that lead them through it. So whereas the Alliance are fighting to save the city and every boss they fight is to that end, Horde players are just there to see what cool things they can steal and kill the dungeon bosses because they're in the way. Like all dungeons, this will have a Mythic Plus option and be played competitively, so despite any differences, has to be perfectly balanced between the two factions. What it does show at the very least is that Blizzard are willing to try out the idea of a different PvE instance experience depending on what faction you play. And then I think, what if really the final raid is the exact same raid for Horde and Alliance, but essentially just a reskin? What if the last raid of Battle for Azeroth is an epic face-off between the two factions as hinted at in the trailer, where the beginning of the raid is the open battlefield and your raid team has to fight its way behind enemy lines? The same mechanics would be in place for each faction, it's just the Horde would be fighting Alliance mobs and the Alliance Horde versions. And then what if once you and your elite raiding force break through the lines, the bosses you fight are the exact same bosses, but it's just their names, art, and sound assets that were different? Okay, so maybe the first boss the Alliance face is, I don't know, Zappy Boy, and the first Horde boss is some awesome Wildhammer Shaman. They both have the same room the fight takes place in, it just has different art assets appropriate to the faction. They both have the exact same abilities, they just have different model skins and voice lines. They are the exact same boss with the exact same mechanics, except in the story of the battle, one makes sense for the Horde to be fighting, one makes sense for the Alliance to take out. Although obviously if the boss really is Zappy Boy, then it's going to take more than 20-man Mythic raid to beat him. You are going to need full Vindicar air support and Titan buffs to even scratch him, and even then he doesn't die at the end, he just gets bored, drops his loot and heads to another part of the battlefield. But you get what I'm saying. And the same could be true for the whole raid. The layout is exactly the same physically, the bosses are the same mechanically, it's just the aesthetics that are different depending on your faction. So the raid would be perfectly balanced, because in all the ways that matter, it's the same raid, just feels different. And this could be true all the way to the final fight. The Alliance take out a big Horde Azerite war machine. The Horde take out a big Alliance Azerite war machine. The Horde take out a badass Kul Tiran Druid general we got introduced to this expansion who has cool shapeshift ability mechanics. The Alliance take out a badass Zandalar Druid general we got introduced to this expansion who has the exact same shapeshift mechanics, but, you know, dinosaurs. Now, obviously, this would take a whole ton more work from the art and design team than they'd usually be expected to put in for a raid, but it's still a whole ton less work than creating two entirely distinct raids for Horde and Alliance. And also, it would be so cool. I mean, come on, a raid where you actually start on a huge Horde versus Alliance battlefield and genuinely take part in a war-deciding conflict, where you have the satisfaction of taking out recognizable characters from the opposing faction. It would be amazing, it would be epic, and more importantly, it would fit in entirely with the stated theme of the expansion. And why not take out some important characters along the way? Because then the Alliance don't just feel great that they killed, say, G Firepaw in the battle, they also feel really sad because while they were doing that, the Horde killed Acer Cloudsong, building on that faction rivalry even more. And then, of course, there's the ultimate question, the final boss for each faction and the lasting impact a raid like this would have. Because the last boss of the last raid of the expansion has to, by definition, be pretty important. As in, if the final raid really is an all-out fight between Horde and Alliance, it really should be the character in charge of each army, right? Which would mean the most obvious candidates would be the faction leaders themselves, Anduin in the Horde raid and Sylvanas in the Alliance version. And in fairness, this would be pretty mind-blowing. To take out two such huge, iconic characters would be massive and possible with separate faction raids, without anyone feeling cheated. Both faction leaders are bosses and die, but unlike, say, Siege of Lordaeron, neither faction has to actually fight or rebel against the leader of their own faction, and neither character has to turn evil. It's enough to fight them just because they are the opposing faction leader. It would also make that awesome Battle for Azeroth cinematic even more meaningful. Turns out it wasn't just the Banshee Queen and the Crying Angel Boy showing off what they could do, it was a genuine first look at who the final bosses of the whole expansion were going to be. Oh my god, wait, there could even be an ad phase of the fight where they call on soldiers to fight them and we kill the soldiers, and then Sylvanas raises the soldiers from the dead in the Alliance fight and Anduin does his Crying Angel faced mass res in the Horde version. This is so perfect, I'm an actual genius. Having said that, whereas I can see everything else I've discussed here happening, that doesn't mean I think it will happen, it means I believe it's possible. Anduin and Sylvanas being the final bosses is not something I can imagine. Or at least not Anduin. Mostly because if the pre-Legion graphic novelettes are canon, which they are, then Anduin is going to survive whatever Battle for Azeroth holds and live long enough to hang in the old people's home with Velen later on. And if Anduin isn't the Horde big bad, then I can't see the Alliance killing Sylvanas because, you know, faction balance. So how about the two next most important characters on each side? That would be Genn Greymane and Nathanos Blightcaller. Both are big, important characters in their own right. Both have had plenty of character focus in recent times and promise to be central to the action in Battle for Azeroth. And whereas only one of them is a very good boy, the deaths of either would be a major event in game lore and worthy of being the final fight of an expansion. True, Nathanos is a Dark Ranger and favours ranged combat, whereas Genn is more of a melee kind of dog, so you'd imagine it would be quite difficult to make them the same boss with the same mechanics, but I'm sure Blizz could find a way to work it out. Or, okay, how about a more close quarters Horde leader, like, just off the top of my head, Saurfang? And what a way to build excitement for the final raid. You are taking out the second in command of the opposing faction for keeps, and decimating their forces to do it. At the end of this raid, both sides would be in disarray, because yes, if you're a Horde player, you've cut a swathe through the Alliance and killed Genn Greymane, but at the same time, the Alliance did the same to your armies and took out Nathanos. You win, but you lose. War, eh? What was it good for? And this is what really excites me about this idea, because of what it could lead to. So after the final raid, players have had the satisfaction of defeating the opposing faction's armies and killing some major lore figures, and the result is that both armies are broken and decimated. The chain of command for each side is in turmoil. The forces of Azeroth as a whole are severely weakened. What better time for the old gods to make their move? Because most players think that the faction war in this expansion will only last as long as it takes for the old gods to become an obvious threat, at which point the Horde and Alliance team up to defeat the final boss and lead into a Void-themed expansion next time out. But what if Blizzard play it a little bit cooler than that? What if the devs wait until the very end of Battle for Azeroth, let us get really into the faction war, make us all super hyped for a final raid where we deal a huge blow to the opposing faction, and only then, when both armies have suffered profound losses and are at their absolute weakest, have the old gods make their move? How terrifying would that be? How stupid would we feel if in the aftermath of the climactic battle of the war, which ends in a bloody but satisfying for the player stalemate, when we are looking around the battlefield contemplating the mindless destruction of it all, that's when tentacles rise from the deep. That's when an army of faceless ones emerge from the waves. That's when the sleeping city of Nyalotha awakens, and that's when the old gods return. So what do you think, guys? I wanted to talk about this because it's something so many people have mentioned in comments on our videos, whereas at first the thought of different final bosses for Horde and Alliance seemed pretty out there, the more I thought about how it would work, and the more I learned about Battle for Azeroth as an expansion, the more feasible it sounded to me, honestly. Do you think this could be something Blizzard go for? Could it even work as I described it, or have I missed a pretty obvious reason as to why this idea is impossible? Are you certain that Blizzard will take the tried and tested method of essentially abandoning the faction war towards the end of the expansion and have Horde and Alliance unite against a common foe as usual? Well, let us know in the comments below. And thank you for joining us today. If you liked this video, don't thank us, thank our patrons who give their actual real-life money to make these videos happen. Whether it be essays like this or the weekly reset, it's all down to them, so thank you guys so much. If you didn't like it, downvote the shit out of it. Remember, my name is Annie Fuchsia. No, my name is Taliesin from me and Evitel. Until next time, cheerio.